Hi everyone, this video is coming to you from the Free Growing Working Group. The group was created to recommend potential options for improving the free growing framework. Now to do that, we needed to start by reviewing the framework to understand what it does well and where it fails to meet current needs. In this video, I'm going to highlight some of the limitations, and I'll be demonstrating them through several case studies. But before I do that, I'm going to quickly review the current free growing framework. So it's largely a mechanism to ensure stands are promptly reforested and put on the right path towards a desired future stand condition. Licensees are responsible for regeneration activities up to free growing, and they are reimbursed for this work through the appraisal system. Licensees need to achieve stocking standards defined in their forest stewardship plans. Silviculture surveys assess compliance with these standards using well-spaced free growing tree counts. The stocking standards are typically linked to sawlog timber objectives for mature stand conditions. The free growing policy led to some wonderful changes in the 1980s. It led to substantial improvements to reforestation and significant advances in silviculture. It led to the adoption of ecologically based species selection for reforestation, and it spurred the development of stocking standards for hundreds of site series. But the policy has now been around for 35 plus years, and it may no longer be fully meeting our expectations. I'm now going to review some of the limitations associated with the current free growing framework by running through a few case studies. For case study 1, we will have 8 cut blocks totaling 275 hectares in the CWH VM1 in a timber supply area. All blocks are O1 leading, so they have the same stocking standard, but it's a single block stocking standard, so it needs to be achieved on each individual stratum. Under this standard, you need to have 500 to 1,000 free growing stems per hectare using any of the 8 listed species. You can see it at the bottom of the slide. All species are considered preferred. And this is a real standard, this is not a hypothetical. So, under this standard, there's a huge amount of flexibility for species. In theory, you could reforest all of the blocks with straight hemlock, or 100% Amabilis fir, or Douglas fir, or all red cedar, or spruce, or white pine. Or you could go for some diversity. You could aim for that diversity at the landscape level by managing each block for a different species. Or you could manage different SUs within a single block for different species, so these 3 blocks. Or you could do more of an intimate mixture, like these blocks. Those decisions would impact stand dynamics and long-term outcomes like volume and value. They could also influence your landscape's resiliency to natural disturbances like wildfire or to pests like blister rust or weevil. For this case study, we're going to run through 2 scenarios. For the first scenario, you work for a licensee that was struggling financially during the recession. Management viewed silviculture as a cost, and they pushed you to spend the minimum amount to pass legal requirements. You weren't happy about it, but you figured if you're still hitting free growing, that the stands should turn out okay. After all, stocking standards are meant to put you on the right path towards a desired future stand condition, right? So with that mindset, your objective became achieving free growing. You let the blocks naturally regenerate. Stocking was low, just barely above the minimum stocking standard and entirely reliant on hemlock, but you met the stocking standard on every single stratum, so hooray! Given you did meet free growing on all strata, you weren't sure if you sacrificed an unacceptable amount of volume by using natural regeneration, or accepting borderline free growing densities, or strictly relying on hemlock. You also aren't sure what it would mean at a landscape level. You're not the only licensee operating in this TSA or in the CWH VM1. The government doesn't actually do any cumulative checks, so you don't know if this would impact their landscape level objectives for volume, value, species diversity, wildlife habitat, or carbon sequestration. You decide to model it out in TIPSY to compare species, free growing densities, and planting versus natural regeneration. But TIPSY doesn't actually allow you to use free growing numbers as inputs.
Our surveys focus on well space, total well space, and free-growing tree counts, but that's not what's being used by modelers. Nevertheless, for the sake of understanding trends, you assume the free-growing densities are equal to planting densities, and you model everything out to year 80. Planted hemlock would be a decent choice. Other than spruce, hemlock at both high and low densities generates more volume across the blocks than any other species. Also, by planting at 1,000 stems per hectare with hemlock, the total volume would be 10% higher than managing to minimums. But you didn't actually plant. You let everything naturally regenerate with hemlock. So you want to model the actual stand conditions and compare. So you plug in the free-growing density, same as the planted runs, and it gives you a really low volume. You're not sure if it should be that significant, or if it's more a function of what you entered. Maybe you actually should have entered total density. You're not sure. Overall, the link between survey results and model inputs is very unclear to you. You also want to get a rough idea of value. So you multiply the volumes by current J-grade prices to understand the trends. Despite spruce creating way more volume than any other species, that doesn't translate to more value. Cedar, which produced less volume than spruce, hemlock, and balsam, generates roughly $30 million more across these blocks than managing to any other species. So you stop and think for a second. What exactly is the objective? Were you supposed to be maximizing volume, value, saw logs, or promoting biodiversity given the number of species in the stocking standard? Or should you be creating a resilient landscape given climate change and forest health issues? Based on the model, you could grow a lot more volume if you planted straight spruce, but it doesn't seem like a good choice from a resiliency standpoint. The LMH number 28 says Sitka spruce is only a suitable minor species, and the FDP recommended stocking standards don't include spruce as a preferred or acceptable species. Also, you check the KISS tool and it shows as being mostly unsuitable until 2040. Long term, it is expected to improve, but establishment in the shorter term could be problematic. You're also worried about weevil. Clearly, there's a range of possible outcomes within the single stocking standard, and given there's no follow-up or a cumulative check, you find that worrisome. All right, scenario 2. We're now pretending like these same blocks were managed by a different licensee. This licensee has a great silviculture program. In 99% of the area, they were within 5% of the target stocking standard at free growing. They generate significant volume and value across these 275 hectares. They also consciously manage for stand and landscape species diversity. Despite all of this licensee is at risk for being in non-compliance. They have a small 2-hectare cut block that still isn't meeting the minimum stocking standard despite 2 replants. So we need to consider scale. Is it worth replanting this area for a 3rd time? Does it make sense to expect this licensee to replant again, given they've generated significant volume and value across these 275 hectares? Also, does it make sense to focus on these 2 hectares, given they'd be allowed if they were simply within a 40-plus hectare block using a PPR 46112? We also need to consider what we're really trying to accomplish. Do we care about achieving a minimum density on every single stratum? Or do we want to focus on achieving landscape level objectives?
Okay, we're now going to do a second case study with a slightly different focus. So again, you're going to be a licensee operating in a timber supply area, but this time 3 of your blocks have a wildlife objective. In the wildlife focus blocks, you'll be managing for grizzly bear habitat. Your forest stewardship plan has a grizzly bear stalking standard modeled after the FDP reference guide. With the help of your company biologists and some literature, you develop a silviculture regime to enhance forage. During harvesting, your crews will minimize disturbance to vegetation, understory trees, and coarse woody debris. After logging, you'll complete a light broadcast burn. The site will then be planted with cedar, spruce, hemlock, and mattless fir in clusters. If brushing is needed, you'll do barrel brushing.
so it's focused on each crop tree in order to maintain as many forage species as possible. All the references and the biologists indicate that thinning treatments may be required long-term to maintain a partially open canopy. That would happen after free growing though, so it won't be your responsibility. You don't know how you'll communicate this to the government or who will actually make sure that it happens long term. Overall, you're quite concerned about whether this regime will actually work, especially if it's only implemented up to free growing. You're also confused by the Silviculture survey. It focuses on well-spaced and free-growing tree counts as per usual, but free-growing numbers don't tell you whether or not grizzly bears are actually using the site. The survey also doesn't focus on the quantity, distribution, or type of brush species, so you can't even assess the habitat quality or whether you've achieved your goal for the site. Finally, you're concerned about costs. You're getting the normal silvicultural appraisal amount despite following a very different silviculture regime. You don't think it's nearly enough, so you're contemplating cutting the broadcast burn to save money. But you don't know what the consequence of that would be on achieving the objective. But you also know that wouldn't prevent you from passing free growing, and technically that's all that you need to achieve.
Okay, moving on to our final case study. This time, you're a contract silviculturalist. You've been hired by a licensee to handle the reforestation activities and surveys for a handful of blocks in the Kamloops timber supply area in the IDF. You're really excited to complete the project because the company mostly used alternative silvicultural systems on these blocks. They were trying to emulate natural ecological processes, ensure successful regeneration, and address non-timber values like visuals and wildlife. But you become less impressed when you get boots on the ground to start the regeneration delay surveys. You find that many of the retained trees are poor form and quality. A lot of trees are suppressed with little capacity now to respond to the released growing space. Also, you recognize that some of the dispersed mature Douglas fir have root disease, and they planted Douglas fir in the surrounding areas without stumping. It also seems that uneven age stalking standards have been applied to all blocks with higher levels of tree retention, but uneven age standards are only meant for stands planned for uneven age management, where there's 3+ stand entries. So they'd be suitable for this block, but none of these. Unfortunately, when stalking standards are misapplied, you aren't able to properly check if the stand is on track for meeting the objective because there is no link between the standards, the stand management goals, and the objectives anymore. This is especially true with the uneven age standards with the multi-storied survey method and the even age standards with the layered survey method. For both, you just tally well-spaced and free-growing trees by layer. There is little consideration to vigor, crown size, or tree size. There is also no recognition that different species might be suitable in the overstory versus the understory given wind firmness and shade tolerance. Anyways, time passes, you're back in the area again 15 years later. You start with a free growing survey on this hybrid block where they did a single entry, leaving dispersed long-term retention to meet a visuals objective. Unfortunately, their choice of leaf trees wasn't great. They weren't wind firm, and now many of them have blown over. But the block still meets free growing off the layer 3 and 4 trees. But did this block meet the initial stand structural goals? Well, you'd venture to say probably not, given the amount of wind throw. Anyways, in the afternoon, you go to the next survey block to do a regeneration delay survey, and you have a weird sense of deja vu. It takes you a few minutes, but you realize that it was actually the single tree selection block, but it's now a clear cut. You're positive that was meant to be managed long term to maintain an uneven aged class structure, so you're disappointed and confused that the regime wasn't followed. Though you're not really sure how the licensee would have actually communicated that to the government and other licensees after it was declared free growing. There is no link with the forest tenure and administration system to identify stands that should not be harvested due to planned harvest reentries. All right, so that wraps up the case studies. I hope they highlighted some of the limitations in the implementation of the current free growing policy. I think they raised the need for further discussion, For example, we need clear objectives. Most stocking standards in the province have a loose saw log objective, but this may not always be clear given the number of species or the density range that exists in some stocking standards. Also, without a cumulative check, we may not be achieving that objective at the landscape level, despite hitting our stocking standards on each stratum. Tying in with that, it's important to understand that species selection can have a bigger impact on volume, value, forest health, and resiliency than density. We need to be aware of how our species selection choices can impact our landscape objectives. Next, silviculture funding. Funding is not linked to outcomes, so silviculture can often be viewed as a cost to be minimized versus an investment in our future. Furthermore, the silviculture cost allowance is calculated for large units, and costs can vary based on site conditions, forest health issues, or different regimes, like we saw in the grizzly bear example. If actual costs are higher than the silviculture cost allowance on an individual management unit, silviculturalists may feel pressure, which could result to not achieving targets. Also related to finances, the second scenario highlighted the importance of scale and the potential for inefficient silviculture spending. Next, these scenarios highlighted how easy it is to just focus on achieving free growing versus the long-term objective. It's easy to do that when licensee silviculturalists only manage up to free growing. Having two groups of silviculturalists can make it hard to implement full stand development pathways. This can be made even worse when applying non-clear-cut silvicultural systems on volume-based tenures. You can set up a stand for uneven age management by using a single tree selection system, but once the stand is free growing, another licensee can come in and clear-cut it. Now, switching themes to survey and metrics, we spent a significant amount of time collecting well-spaced free-growing tree counts and other silviculture label information. But this data doesn't help initialize TAST or TIPSY. Furthermore, these metrics do not help us understand whether we are on track for achieving non-timber objectives like grizzly bear habitat or wildfire resiliency or carbon sequestration. Lastly, there is fairly limited long-term monitoring. So we don't fully understand how our stands are changing through time, whether the models are projecting them accurately, or if our silviculture regimes are effective, especially given climate change. It's also important to highlight that the free growing framework is closely related to other work already underway. Discussions about improving the free growing policy will need to take into consideration the work of many other groups and programs like the ones listed on this slide. So, the Free Growing Working Group has now written a discussion paper that covers some of these challenges and outlines options for improvement. We believe a two-phase approach will be necessary given the province is transitioning from forest stewardship plans to forest landscape plans. So, for areas managed under FSPs, Phase 1 options would apply. They mostly address the provincial inventory, forest health, and climate change. Some of these changes have already been released, like the 2023 Silviculture Survey Manual updates and the REIS BMPs that will become mandatory in 2025 and 2026. Then, Phase 2 will apply to blocks developed under forest landscape plans. Phase 2 is expected to incorporate the stand development pathways and silvicultural systems developed by the FLP working groups to meet the stand and forest objectives and outcomes set at the planning table. In the paper, we present four options to highlight how the free growing policy could potentially change to address the limitations outlined in this presentation and to enable the implementation of FLPs. But it is not an exclusive list. They're just presented to generate discussion and feedback. Elements of the various options could be blended, and multiple options may be needed to address different objectives or landscape zoning. We also expect and hope that you'll come up with other completely different options. Okay, that's a wrap. I hope this presentation makes you excited to read the Modernizing BC's Free Growing Policy paper. After you do that, we would love your feedback. For example, did we miss any limitations? What do you think would best address these limitations? What is your vision for silviculture in BC? You can provide this input by filling out a survey. You can access it with this QR code or the link in the YouTube video's description. Alternatively, you can reach out to Shannon Pierce. Her email is on the slide. She's the one collecting all this feedback. I want to thank you so much for watching and have a great day.